published a story called What ISIS Really Wants. It remains the most read piece in the history of the magazine. This book, The Way of the Strangers, came out of that article. Graham Wood is the author of the book, The Way with Strangers, Encounters with the Islamic State. Graham Wood, thank you for your work, and welcome to the Big 550 KTRS here in St. Louis.
Thank you.
Who is John Gorlalis, or Gorlis? Who is that?
Yeah, it's actually pronounced John Georgeless, and he's an American. He's a countryman of yours and mine from Texas, and he converted to Islam in November of 2001, and then began a long journey that has led him to be the most prominent member of the Islamic State from the United States. And he's currently in Raqqa, and probably the most prominent and important English language propagandist for the group.
Is it possible, in your book, The Way of the Strangers, is it possible, Graham Wood, that you're saying that he might be in charge of ISIS in the not-too-distant future?
Well, John Georgeless has risen through the ranks pretty quickly, and detectively, too. He has been writing under aliases that I've been able to uncover, and has, since his arrival there in mid-2015, become more and more prominent. Now, there was the death of the second in command of ISIS earlier this month, or earlier this year, rather, and his successor was named earlier this month. That successor's name is one of the aliases of John Georgeless. Now, it doesn't mean that John Georgeless is necessarily that same person. These names are aliases, and there's only a certain number of Arabic name permutations that are out there. But it is suggestive, and so I'll be watching closely to see what signs there are that person, that successor, is in fact John Georgeless of Dallas, Texas.
Your book, The Way of the Strangers, chronicles a number of Americans who left their somewhat cush and plentiful life here in America to go take up and fight with ISIS. You mentioned this John Georgeless, who comes from a Greek Orthodox family in Texas with a long military history. Why would this 17-year-old turn his back on all of America and join ISIS?
Well, if you ask him, it is the only way you can be a Muslim. He was very committed, even before the existence of ISIS, to a pretty hardline view of what Islam is. So when ISIS came around, you could see there was not going to be any question in his mind that he had to give his allegiance to ISIS. What he turned his back on, though, is extraordinary. He was not poor. He was actually from a very wealthy family, a family with, as I say, a distinguished patriotic lineage of military service to this country. And I think what he looked at was a future where he would not live up to the traditions of his family or of his country. And so he rejected it, looked for ways to succeed elsewhere, and unfortunately found the Islamic State as the ultimate form of rebellion against his family's high expectations.
It's always amazes to me these young Americans who sort of leave this life of privilege to go and basically live in the dirt in the Middle East. You found a young man who came from a conservative Christian family. Who was that?
Well, that Georgeless actually falls into that category, but you'd find others too, like Musa Cherantonio of Melbourne, Australia, is another person who he was from a fairly observant Catholic family there. And again, it was not a case of his being poor. It was not a case of his looking elsewhere for a better life. In some ways, he was actually looking for a worse life. He was looking for more challenges, more difficulties. And he's currently in jail in Australia because he had, after expressing very clear jihadist views, was being watched by their equivalent of the FBI and found putting a boat in the water trying to get from Australia to Islamic State territory.
Graham Wood, our guest, your book getting a lot of attention, The Way of the Strangers, Encounters with the Islamic State. We have heard recently that they have become somewhat disillusioned with ISIS. Are we seeing less people join up with ISIS who come from these backgrounds?
Well, the world collectively has unified against ISIS, and it's made it much more difficult for people to go and fight on ISIS's behalf in its core territory. So we have definitely seen a steep drop-off of immigrants to ISIS. There have been probably about 40 to 45,000 people who have gone to fight on ISIS's behalf. Unfortunately, the next trend is for ISIS to tell them, don't even try to do that anymore. Instead, stay where you are, attack in your home countries. And when we see, for example, the attack in Berlin, in Nice earlier this year, Paris last year, Orlando in this country, San Bernardino, that is the fruit of those instructions, and I think we're going to see more of that as well.
What does America do? What does the world do to sort of combat this?
Well, some of the military options that we have are, of course, already being pretty vigorously pursued, and with a lot of success, I should say. The United States has led a drone program that has been very successful in killing off leaders of ISIS. The original cast and crew of ISIS is no longer on this planet with us because they've been taken out. Now, that's only going to take us so far, though. The number I gave you before, 40,000 people have gone, actually physically gone. Imagine how many people have stayed at home who were kind of on the fence and who were waiting to see how well ISIS would do, but who were totally on board with all the things that ISIS was telling them. Those people are probably, many of them, still out there. And what we have to know is the nature of the support that they give. What is it that they think is so great about ISIS? What has convinced them to sign on for basically the most brutal group on the planet?
Graham, yeah. I got to leave it there. Graham Wood is the author. The book is called The Way of the Strangers, Encounters with the Islamic State. Graham, thank you for your work, and good luck with the book.
Thank you.
You got it. Unbelievable. 650, 8